Yeah, the early, he believed it to be the closest thing to our evolutionary precursor that first had a forebrain. Most primitive forebrain, and so.
That's a very useful diagram.
And there's a guy named Herrick who did a lot of the research on the salamander.
Huh.
Herrick, starting in the 40s, I think. So, briefly, neuropercolation I don't understand extremely well, but it's a random graph model that's more computationally tractable than the differential equations, and it's dynamically equivalent to the K-sets. They've proven that up through K3. It's got the same kind of phase transitions in the dynamics. And Robert has a paper with a guy named Puljic that came out last year that has the proof for this equivalence. And I'm reading it. It's not super hard, at least the groundworks for it are, but it gets complicated pretty fast. The random graph model is a winner-take-all, a majority rules cellular automaton type setup. Have you heard of probabilistic cellular automata?
Heard of it, don't know much about it, but.
What they are is a set of, it's like a graph where there's a state for each node, and the edges determine which states have to be considered to update to the next node at the state at the next time step.
But the cellular automata has the property that every node looks like every other node.
Well, that would depend on the connection pattern.
No, but that's what makes it a cellular automata is that.
What do you mean looks like?
The connection patterns are all the same everywhere.
Then perhaps I mistook it, but maybe I misapplied the term, but that's not what I remember. That it has to be.
I thought that, okay, so my understanding
it could be that that's what they have, but I didn't. I
thought
was
for
aware of that, and I'm not sure.
I thought for a cellular automata, each one of the different nodes has the same transition logic based upon its neighbors, and that the system will evolve based upon its neighbors. Each one won't look necessarily the same at each transition time, but the logic is identical in all of those different cells.
The logic is identical and the connections are identical.
Connections are identical. Oh, in terms of the neighbors that are visible from each cell.
Okay.
Is that true? Because like on the borders,
yeah.
So usually you'll see it in terms of like a two-dimensional grid, and on the bottom, I don't know if it's necessarily a torus going up to
I don't think it has to be a topologically closed system, which is would be a requirement.
Maybe I'm wrong about that. Well, it's been a long time since I've looked at it.
The first
I don't know in
place,
that much depth.
the first place
I
I
remember studying cellular automata with Max Garson.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
do you remember Stuart Kaufman's?
We even used it some in
Yeah.
papers.
It came up in the parallel computation class as well, because I think that concept is used in some parallel architectures as well.
Do you remember Stuart Kaufman's At Home in the Universe?
I reviewed it once.
Yeah, he has a very fairly elaborate treatment written understandable by it's not too technical of such sets, a certain kind of such set, and I can't remember what they're called. They're not K. There's some other NK or something NK something. Anyway.
I have to get out my review.
But this the rule for this graph, the rule is that in order to determine the next state of this node, you look at the current state of all of its neighboring nodes,
Yes.
and if the majority of them are on, then it will.
And you're on.
No, I don't know. There's a high probability that it will transition in a certain way if the majority are on, and if the majority are off, there is 1 minus that high probability. that it will transition in the same way. I think that's how it works. But in any event,
That's the random graph model.
yes, and you can see why that's a lot more computationally tractable than solving the differential equations. And it's interesting but I don't understand much more than is on this slide. So 518, we're nearly out of time, and I'm almost finished reviewing Freeman. Good grief, I'm going to skip that. It's interesting, but we're out of time. I wanted to try to do a little of the tie-in. To kind of introduce the tie-in, this is a Freeman quote, an appropriate model of cortex is a sheet of distributed coupled oscillators. That might be a sheet of distributed coupled oscillators also, and it happens to be 8 by 8, 64 metronomes.
So the oscillators are, as a group, are coupled, or you're saying that pairs are coupled?
The coupling dynamics can vary greatly from cycle to cycle. That's part of the expressive or responsive range of the cortex, I think. It can very flexibly and adaptively and rapidly develop coupling patterns across the whole sheet. Now this one we have a single attractor, all these metronomes are synchronized, and this is really just 64, whereas the you could have a sheet that has millions or billions of oscillators.
I got it.
Okay. Now, so I'm going to try to tell a little story here, and this is an experiment. We understand from past talks that synchronization occurs with these oscillators. There is a initial state that's disordered, and then there's a phase transition that takes place as a result of the coupling, and then there's an attractor where there's a final state which is synchronized. So, once upon a time, there was a universe of matter and energy, an ocean of clusters that could interact in different ways. Now, imagine that each of these circles of different size is a cluster or clump of energy and matter, and the interaction patterns, the dark arrows are supposed to be strong couplings, and the dashed arrows are supposed to be weak couplings, but they could be any which way. They could be more than just pairs. I've got dyads here, but they could be any kind of combination of interactions between all these entities in the universe. And as the universe progresses over time, the things that are strongly coupled, they may move around, but they're going to move around together. And the ones that are weakly coupled are going to stretch out, and they're going to eventually lose their coupling, and the weaker ones are going to, and we're going to be left with some strongly coupled pairs that are stable in the sea of kind of white, kind of patternless, void in between. So now we have a little dyad that we're going to call A and B, and think of them as, variations of chemical activity, a pattern here and a pattern there. And at some point, this compartment evolves around A to give it a little bit of a buffer zone, so it can persist and perhaps not be as dependent upon the presence of B. But it's still pretty tightly coupled to B. If it's away if the connection gets stretched too far, then the coupling will break, and it will be all alone and will die out because it's not being driven by its source. So in this environment, B is kind of weakly correlated with some other energy variation. And by the way, we haven't, mentioned this in the past, but all of these oscillators are going to be impacted by all kinds of energies from who knows where. And when we write A and B with the strong arrows and nothing else, we're kind of ignoring and hopefully not forgetting the fact that there's all these other energies that are going to be affecting A and B, and then also any kind of thing that correlates with B, well, it's not going to just correlate only with B necessarily. There are other things that could interact with that energy pattern. But we have a low energy pattern here in the environment that has some reliable correlation with what's happening in B, and the organism over time develops the, not the same organism, but organisms in general over evolutionary time develop the ability to have small dynamical systems within themselves which correlate with that small dynamical system. And so we get this kind of evolution of cognition in this way. Now, quickly, this little Barham quote, living systems achieve limited autonomy from local high energy potentials by becoming sensitive to non-local low energy fluxes. And so this is really talking about proximal cues for distant or distal events. And so A and B, the C here, this low energy oscillator, gives a cue to the organism that is, for instance, a food source, and allows the organism to choose an action of consuming or approaching or what have you at a point where it's more likely to be a successful or a useful expenditure of energy. And so this is sort of what Barham considers the basis of cognition in living systems.
So Steve, going back to that for 1 second. So you made the statement, well, not the same organism, this is over evolutionary time. But wouldn't learning be an example of D being an oscillator that's created within the same organism in
Yes.
response to the environment? And
Yes.
so
And that
either
would
way
be the same-
works.
Yeah. I just, the ability to have these,
Right.
So for instance, back here you might have an organism like an algae
Mhm.
that doesn't move around, and if it's on a surface that happens to be, exposed to light
Mhm.
and with the proper, moisture and so forth,
Right.
and there happens to be some sort of food source, like maybe some glucose or the makings, the atmospheric, the gaseous makings for photosynthesis, well, then it's going to do well. But if all those things which are kind of like in B, if they go away, well, it's not going to do well.
Sure.
And so its autonomy,
Mhm.
it doesn't have much autonomy.
Right.
So the variation in B the coupling is so strong that if something happens to B, well, the same thing happens to the organism. If B goes to 0, so does the organism.
Right.
Bye-bye algae. And so now, if you've got, there are some unicellular algae that have a photoreceptor and a flagellum. And the photoreceptor can activate the flagellum to flap it so that it moves in the direction of increasing light gradient. And so now it's got some ability, if the light over here changes, it can move in a different place
Sure.
where there might be more light. And so it's got a little bit more autonomy over the variation of this oscillator that it was dependent on before it could move. And before it could move, random motion may improve its chances for survival, but the ability to move a certain way in response to a variation in the environment is what this kind of coupling, it gives it the autonomy and improves the chances for survival.
Up a nutrient gradient.
Yep, chemotaxis. Yep. That is a photo, the first one was phototaxis, and that's chemotaxis.
That may be the very genesis of intelligent design,
Yeah,
you know?
Sure.
About as basic as you could get.
yeah.
So, how so? Do you mean intelligent design?
He's talking about the evolution of these things, the evolution of
To
these
me,
things
that's
is
step one.
Intelligent design.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's what humans are doing now. They're doing intelligent design. They've knocked the gods out of the equation entirely.
I don't know where
Somatic.
God, I don't know if God is coupled to this, you know? to these
I
intellectual
just told a joke.
oscillations. I know. Let's see, anyway. Okay, so here we have Barham's diagram with the labels back. And just doing this so that we can kind of review the other systems that we've looked at and do a comparison. We got the high energy oscillator, the low energy oscillator, the coupling, the weak coupling for, for having a self-organizing system will be the dotted lines, and we have attractors being set up in the different places. This little guy D gets called the epistemon in the terminology of Barham. Now, I really should have changed this to be, this is a Gibson terminology, and I should have changed this to be the surround instead of the environment. No, environment's okay for Gibson. But the light reflecting surfaces are an example. The ambient illumination is the energy in the environment that has information about those surfaces. The invariance, the optic invariance, this indicates the optic invariance, are the structure here that lets us perceive certain aspects of these surfaces in the environment. And then the affordances are like the attractors here that connote certain actions. So the dynamics, the perception and action are linked by the dynamics in this formulation. And so this is as you pointed out, kind of a mashup or an overlay of the Gibson idea with the Barham's dynamics. Now, if we go to Freeman, it's really very similar. We have the meaningful object, we have the emitted information, and we have the percept. And the attractor dynamics, the sheet of coupled oscillators, which is cortex, is really going to kind of spread over here, and each one of these possible actions and possible percepts are going to be in a large landscape of attractor landscapes, if you will. A very complex and maybe fractally organized landscape of attractors. Okay, so this is the kind of getting close to what we said here, and this is tentative, subject to your review and approval. It could be wrong in places, and is in need of review and possible correction. So, the metronomes at the top, we're just looking at the kind of system, and then looking at what the oscillators are, the coupling principle, and what the states look like that correspond to the attractors, or the final state of the trajectory. So, any questions? I can go through it, but I think y'all can just review it yourselves.
Yep, that lays it out, doesn't it?
Now, this is a kind of an attempt to begin the kind of mashup that you were talking about.
Yeah, have to think about that. Or I would.
And I
But
don't,
it looks like it might work.
well, maybe it's the beginning of something. I don't know how much this reveals. I don't know if this goes to the full potential of what you suggested
Well,
you could have with such a
I was
overlay.
coming from the geographic information systems, the course I sat through for a semester, where they were laying data over data. And I have to go back to, I don't know whether you can overlay intellectual theories, abstract theories over abstract theories. I don't know whether that would work the same as geographical plus measles, as I said, and that sort of. I don't know whether intellectually, I don't know whether
May not,
that,
but it's very close to.
but it looks like you might be able to do it. It looks like you might. I don't know.
So what you've got here clearly works at least metaphorically. The question is there more to it than that?
Yeah, I think that the real suggestion here is that the dynamical principles, there's something in self-organizing dynamics called
It's more
universality.
than metaphor.
Yeah, there's something called
Yeah,
universality in chaotic dynamics,
Yeah.
whereby systems that are completely different
Yeah,
approach chaos in the same way. The
Yeah.
description at a somewhat mathematical level is universal across these different.
it's a stronger claim than metaphor.
Yeah, and that's the suggestion here, and I don't know, for me, it intuitively feels right.
It's attractive.
Attractive, yes. But more than just attractive, there's something about it that feels right to me at a level. I see a way of talking about describing, yes, it's a metaphor, but it's a metaphor you can live in and get things done. And so that may,
Before you move on, so I need a little bit of help, I'm sorry. So just walking from the top row down. So I understand, so metronomes, those are the things that are oscillating. It's a mechanical device that is an oscillator. That makes perfect sense.
Very strict sense.
So stepping, and the coupling, this is the interaction, the medium in which we're interacting between the different oscillators. Makes perfect sense. Okay, now we go to the biological. So there are two categories that we're talking about of oscillators in this case. High energy oscillators and low energy oscillators. And in the Barham figure that you had before, we had a high energy oscillator and a low energy oscillator. And that's what we're referring to here, different categories of
Yes,
oscillators.
and moreover, within a category, they're not identical.
Okay.
Whereas up here, we had the identical metronomes, but not all low energy oscillators are identical,
Right.
and not all high energy. So there's really the whole, yes, you're correct, there's two categories, but there's the category is not in the sense that all members of the category are identical.
Right, yeah, that makes
So-
perfect sense.
So
I mean,
that's more granularity even,
right.
So
I guess just stopping at that point then, it seems like, so when I'm thinking about the first row with mechanical, metronomes, it's telling me this is a specific instance of an oscillator, a mechanical oscillator. In the biological case, this seems like this is a way of describing oscillators in a biological context. Is that?
yeah, well, the generic nature of the biological context means that you're not specifying what kind of energy is being exchanged, but ultimately what you could say is that the description, the physical description that explains how energy gets exchanged between the metronomes, that causes, in a sense, each metronome is causing or is helping inform each other metronome about
Right.
its own state and jostle it
Right.
so as to
Right, I mean, that
be
makes
more
sense. It just
appropriate.
seems almost like the descriptive language is at a different level in the mechanical versus the biological, meaning that
Yes.
in this case, well, and what I'm trying to say is that for the analogy, at least for me, I'm struggling a little bit with the analogy between mechanical and biological, because it seems like you could describe mechanical oscillators in a general terminology like high energy versus low energy in the same way that you could describe biological in terms of high energy and low energy.
You could make a system.
Because you
that
could
has
say biological could be a neural assembly. That could be an oscillator.
You could have a mechanical system that had metronomes of different sizes and frequencies, or they could be producing patterns that weren't strictly sinusoidal. They could be producing like think of music.
Sure.
Think of melodic and harmonic lines in music. These could be modeled as oscillators if you had some mechanical stimulus and you had some way by which these things are interacting with each other and coupling into a dynamical system.
Okay, so given that point, am I correct in thinking that high energy and low energy are categories and metronomes are a specific instance of something in a mechanical system?
Yes, the first line, at least with the metronome, yes. The metronomes is an example, and perhaps I should say e.g. metronomes. We can't
right.
model all of mechanics.
Because we could also come up with biological examples as well, and that's all I'm trying to get at. I mean, I think that
You've almost got a biological example in the bottom line.
Yeah. I should have said e.g. metronomes.
Well, it almost seems to me that you could almost have a completely different column as well with examples, and I mean, it seems like Anyway, so biological. I mean,
in which case here, the more kind of helpful mashup or whatever might be for the oscillator. You have a physical variable. Or some sort of measurable variable that has a level over time that's changing. And so in the case of metronomes, it would be, say, the phase, or it could be the energy of a system, could vary over time. A mechanical system, its kinetic energy or its potential energy. I mean, obviously it's conservation of energy. It would, if it's a closed system. But in general, these dynamic systems describe open systems that have an input of energy and an outflow of energy that is not constant and not even in some systems, like in the case of a living system, you really can't practically measure what the ongoing input and outgo of energy is in a biological system. You can't. I mean, there's light, there's heat, there's all these different kinds of exchange. There's chemical bonds. There's metabolic factors. There's ways energy is entering and leaving in some form. We presume that the fundamental laws of physics and conservation of energy is not violated, but we can in no way demonstrate it. And the model, it's not a system that lends itself to studying as a conservative system. In fact, it's classified as a non-conservative system. Not that it violates the law, just that our model doesn't benefit from taking into account the conservation principle. And so,
so going a little further on that, going to the perceptual. So when you say perceptual oscillators and state oscillators, so I understand surfaces and illumination. I mean, so some of the terminology that we had talked about before about something being low energy. I mean, illumination is that not a low energy kind of oscillator from a
correct.
High energy source? Okay.
Yeah. Yes, that is exactly right. The illumination is the C. Okay, if we go back to
Okay.
here, the ambient illumination.
Okay. And then going to the final one with EEG activity. So the EEG activity, that's a certain pattern that's observable based upon underlying oscillators.
Yeah, good way to think of it. I think.
Okay.
I think, or you can think of of a pattern in a particular place as being an oscillator. You can think of the neural assemblies underneath as being the oscillators. I think that's probably the better way. The second way you suggested is that there's underlying oscillators, and the activity is a kind of manifestation of it. But the pattern, the AM patterns that are specific are kind of like the attractors. Or, I mean, they are the attractors if Freeman accepts.
Yeah, I think this is a useful way of comparing. I mean, this is good.
Well, it's a start, and let me see, where I went was I had some slides to kind of talk through it, but I think I'll just jump down there and try to put in the last line for LIDA. And say this is where I think of the different oscillators that can happen inside the LIDA model involve things that happen in the workspace and contents, and workspace contents and processes. Now, actually, I really need to include stuff on the action side as well, because that's what the big B oscillator, the functional action is,
Yeah.
or the big A, it was in the lower right. But certainly, this is a partial map, and the global broadcast is sort of like a big attractor. I don't know. I think the PAM nodes would be attractors too, perhaps.
Sure.
Yeah, and so this needs to be updated. This was a late addition and needs more consideration. But this is the direction that I think we go, and I think this is sort of, I mean, sort of the connection. It's sketching the connection between this pattern in the bottom left and the rhythms hypothesis. And I think the self-organizing dynamics and the nonlinear dynamics down here is the connection. I
So
think.
go into the coupling piece there. So all of these, anything that allows interaction between different components of the architecture would potentially be a coupling
We could
example.
think-
I mean, is that not a way of thinking of it? I mean,
I think so, and really the answer to questions like that lies in the practical. What happens if we try to use it that way, and does it turn out to be useful? I think a pragmatic approach is the answer to such a question. You know, we try it, and does believing this or thinking this help us do it better?
right.
You know,
So in this
and I
case, you're
don't
talking
know
about,
yet.
so there might be structures that are built in the workspace that allow this coupling between different, I mean, whatever happens with that. So that's what you're saying right here is the structures in the workspace. That's what you're referring to as structures.
Like the product of structure building codelets.
Right.
And the output of structure building codelets and coalitions, the output of attention, you know, what the work of attention codelets,
Right.
this sort of thing. So, and so one might think, or kind of, that there's like a kind of a theta gamma couplet that's related to a particular coalition, or that's related to a particular percept. And that the one that makes it to biological significance, you know, this pattern might emerge on the bulb, and but it might. I'm Mike.